The security footage would later show exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. That's how long it took Victoria Foster to neutralize 3 armed intruders who had breached the 47th floor of Meridian Financial Tower using nothing but her bare hands and 8 years of training that nobody knew she had. But the cameras couldn't capture what happened in months leading up to that Tuesday morning. They couldn't show the countless times she was dismissed as just the receptionist, the meetings where executives spoke around her as if she were furniture, or the moment she made the split-second decision that would save 17 lives and change everything. This is the story of how the most underestimated person in a 52-story building became the only thing standing between corporate predators and innocent people. It's about the moment when quiet competence met lethal crisis, and why sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the one you need when everything falls apart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Morning sun cast long shadows across the marble lobby of Meridian Financial Tower as Victoria Foster adjusted the nameplate on her reception desk for the 3rd time that week. Someone had knocked it askew again, probably Marcus Chun from the executive floor, who had a habit of leaning across her workspace while completely ignoring her presence. The brass plate read simply V. Foster Reception, though she'd been asking facilities management for 6 months to update it to include her full first name. Victoria arrived every morning at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her official start time, not because she was required to, but because she understood something most people missed. Preparation creates opportunity. While the building's skeleton crew finished their overnight maintenance and the first wave of early executives stumbled through the lobby clutching coffee and scrolling through phones, she conducted her own quiet ritual. First, she checked the overnight security reports, not because it was her job, but because she'd noticed patterns that others missed. Unusual after-hours access attempts, delivery schedules that didn't match the building's protocols, vendors who seemed unfamiliar with standard procedures. She kept her own notes in a leather journal that she disguised as an appointment book, documenting details that the official security logs often overlooked. Then came the real work that nobody saw. Victoria reviewed the building's emergency evacuation routes, mentally timing how long it would take to clear each floor during different scenarios. She studied the facial recognition photos of all building personnel, memorizing names, departments, and access levels. She tracked which executives had standing meetings, which visitors were regulars, and which delivery companies operated on predictable schedules. To everyone else, she was simply early. To Victoria, she was gathering intelligence. The irony wasn't lost on her that in a building filled with financial analysts, risk assessment specialists, and security consultants, she was the only person who actually understood the building's vulnerabilities. But understanding and being heard were two very different things. "Morning, Vicky," called James Patterson as he breezed past her desk without slowing down. Patterson was Meridian's head of operations, a man who wore authority like an expensive cologne and seemed to believe that using her full name would somehow diminish his own importance. He'd been calling her Vicky for 3 years despite her polite corrections, and she'd stopped trying to fix it. Victoria had learned to file these small dismissals away without reaction. In her previous life, the one nobody here knew about, showing emotion in response to disrespect could mean the difference between completing a mission and compromising an entire operation. Now it just meant the difference between keeping her job and being labeled as difficult to work with. "Good morning, Mr. Patterson," she replied with the same professional warmth she offered everyone, regardless of how they treated her. "Your 9:30 with the Hartwell Group has been moved to conference room C. They requested the larger space for their presentation." Patterson paused, actually looking at her for the first time in weeks. "How did you know about the room change?" "I just got that email 20 minutes ago. I coordinate with building services every morning," Victoria explained. When they mentioned setting up additional equipment in Conference Room C, I cross-referenced it with today's schedule and contacted the Hartwell Group directly to confirm their needs. For a moment, Patterson looked genuinely surprised, as if the idea that his receptionist might anticipate problems and solve them proactively had never occurred to him. Then his expression shifted back to its usual dismissive neutrality. Right, well good, keep doing, whatever that was. He disappeared into the elevator bank, leaving Victoria with the familiar sensation of being seen and immediately forgotten. She'd grown accustomed to it, the way people's eyes would pass over her as if she were part of the lobby furniture, how conversations would continue around her as if she couldn't hear every word, the assumption that because she answered phones and directed visitors she couldn't possibly understand anything more complex. What they didn't know was that Victoria Foster had spent 8 years in Army military intelligence before a roadside bomb in Afghanistan ended her military career and left her with a slight limp that most people never noticed. They didn't know. She held a degree in criminal justice with a specialization in threat assessment. They didn't know she spoke 3 languages fluently and could read people's intentions in their micro-expressions and body language. Most importantly, they didn't know that she'd taken this job specifically because it offered something her previous career couldn't: the ability to blend into the background while maintaining a clear view of everything around her. The lobby began filling with the morning rush as Victoria settled into what appeared to be routine receptionist duties. She answered calls with crisp professionalism, directed visitors to appropriate floors, and signed for packages while maintaining the cheerful, unremarkable demeanor that made her invisible to most people who passed through. But beneath the surface, she was conducting constant surveillance. The man in the gray suit who'd been lost in the lobby for 7 minutes, claiming to wait for a colleague who never appeared. The delivery driver who'd asked too many questions about weekend security protocols. The cleaning crew supervisor who'd been replaced without notice and hadn't provided proper identification when questioned. Victoria logged these observations in her disguised journal, noting details that trained security professionals might dismiss as coincidental. In her experience, coincidences were often early warning signs that most people ignored until it was too late. Around 10:15 a.m., she noticed something that made her pen pause mid-sentence. 3 men in maintenance uniforms were examining the elevator bank with unusual intensity. Their uniforms were correct, the right company logo, appropriate color scheme, proper ID badges hanging from regulation lanyards. But their behavior was wrong. Real maintenance workers moved with practiced efficiency, focused on specific tasks and familiar with building layouts. These men kept glancing around the lobby, checking sight lines and exit routes. One of them was taking notes on a clipboard, but his writing position was awkward, as if he wasn't actually recording maintenance information. Victoria continued her reception duties while tracking their movement through her peripheral vision. When one of them approached her desk, she looked up with the same pleasant smile she offered everyone. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't immediately place. "We're doing some work on the upper floor elevators today. Will there be any VIP visits or special security protocols we should know about?" The question sounded reasonable, but it was exactly the wrong question. Real maintenance workers coordinated through building management and already knew about any special protocols. They didn't ask receptionists for security information. "I'd need to direct you to our facilities management office on the 3rd floor, Victoria replied smoothly. "They handle all coordination with outside contractors." The man's smile didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Of course. We just thought we'd check, since you seem to know everything that goes on around here." After they moved away, Victoria made a note in her journal. 3 maintenance contractors, 10:17 a.m., asking inappropriate questions about security protocols. Recommend verification of work orders through proper channels. She knew no one would read her recommendation. In the 3 years she'd worked at Meridian Financial, Her security observations had been politely dismissed as overprotective or unnecessarily detailed. The building's official security team seemed to operate under the assumption that their electronic systems and armed guards were sufficient protection against any realistic threat. But Victoria had seen enough combat zones to know that the most dangerous threats were often the ones that looked exactly like routine business until the moment they revealed their true nature. She'd learned to trust the feeling in her gut that said something was wrong, even when everyone around her insisted everything was fine. As the morning progressed and the lobby filled with the usual parade of executives, clients, and vendors, Victoria maintained her watchful calm. To anyone observing, she was simply doing her job, answering phones, managing the visitor log, coordinating with various departments. In reality, she was conducting the kind of environmental assessment that had kept her alive through multiple deployments in hostile territory. She was noting unusual patterns, tracking suspicious behavior, and preparing for possibilities that she hoped would never materialize, because Victoria Foster understood something that her colleagues had forgotten in their climate-controlled offices and scheduled meetings. The world was full of people who saw opportunity in other people's assumptions about safety. And sometimes, the person everyone dismissed as just the receptionist was the only one paying attention when those opportunities turned deadly. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The executive elevator chimed its arrival at the 47th floor, and Victoria watched through the lobby's security monitors as the morning's power players emerged into their domain of glass offices and leather conference rooms. From her position behind the reception desk, she had access to the building's internal camera system, officially for visitor management, but she'd learned to read the corporate hierarchy through body language and spatial dynamics that played out on those screens. Margaret Whitfield, Meridian's chief operating officer, stepped out first, her platinum heels clicking against marble with the precision of a metronome. She moved like someone who had never questioned whether a door would open for her, whether a seat would be available, or whether her words would be taken seriously. Behind her trailed two junior executives, their postures carefully calibrated to show respect without appearing subservient. Victoria, Margaret's voice carried the particular tone reserved for service personnel, not unkind, but firmly establishing distance. I need you to reschedule my 2 p.m. with the Davidson Group. Something more pressing has come up. Victoria pulled up Margaret's calendar on her screen, already knowing what she'd find. The Davidson Group meeting had been scheduled for 6 weeks, involved 4 other department heads, and represented a potential $12 million contract. The something more pressing was likely lunch with her sorority sister who was visiting from Boston, an appointment that had appeared on Margaret's personal calendar just this morning. Of course, Ms. Whitfield, the Davidson Group had requested this time slot specifically to accommodate their CEO's travel schedule. Would you prefer I suggest alternative dates, or shall I see if they can work with Mr. Patterson as the primary contact? Margaret paused, her expression shifting slightly as she realized Victoria had just pointed out the complexity of what she'd assumed was a simple rescheduling request. For a moment, her professional mask slipped, revealing a flash of irritation at being reminded that her decisions affected other people's carefully coordinated plans. Just handle it, Margaret said finally, waving her hand as if the details were beneath her consideration. You're good at making these things work out. The compliment landed like a backhanded slap. Victoria was indeed good at making impossible ease work, at smoothing over conflicts that executives created through thoughtless decisions, at solving problems that required both diplomatic skill and logistical expertise. But in Margaret's world, being good at making things work out was what you expected from support staff, not what you recognized as professional competence. As Margaret disappeared into her corner office, Victoria began the delicate process of salvaging a multi-million-dollar meeting. She started with a call to Davidson Group's executive assistant, a woman named Linda Chun, who Victoria had built a professional relationship with over months of coordination. "Linda, it's Victoria Foster at Meridian. I have a scheduling challenge, but I'm hoping we can solve together." 20 minutes and 4 phone calls later, Victoria had restructured the entire meeting to accommodate 3 different executive schedules, arranged for a video conference setup to include Davidson's international partners, and coordinated catering that met the dietary restrictions she'd remembered from previous meetings. The Davidson Group would actually get more executive FaceTime than originally planned, and the contract discussions could now include decision-makers who hadn't been available for the original meeting. But when Margaret emerged from her office, an hour later, her only comment was, "Good, I knew you'd figure something out." No acknowledgement of the complexity involved. No recognition that Victoria had just turned Margaret's thoughtless schedule change into a potential business advantage. Just the casual assumption that problems would disappear when handed to competent subordinates. This pattern played out daily, across Meridian's 47 floors. Victoria watched it through security cameras, overheard it in phone conversations, and experienced it firsthand in countless interactions with executives who seemed to believe that their success was entirely self-generated. Take Dr. Richard Hawthorne, Meridian's head of risk assessment. He'd built his reputation on predicting market volatility and identifying potential threats to the company's investments. But he routinely ignored the most basic physical security protocols, leaving confidential documents on his desk overnight, propping open secure doors for his convenience, and discussing sensitive information in elevators where anyone could overhear. Last month, Victoria had noticed a pattern in his behavior that concerned her. Hawthorne had been staying late 3 nights a week, always on the same days, always leaving through the parking garage entrance that had the least security coverage. His routine was so predictable that anyone conducting surveillance could easily anticipate his movements. Victoria had drafted a brief memo outlining her observations and suggesting minor schedule variations that would improve his personal security without disrupting his work routine. She'd submitted it through proper channels, noting that as someone with military intelligence background, she'd noticed patterns that might be worth addressing. The response came back 2 days later, through James Patterson. "Please remind reception staff that security assessments should be left to security professionals. Ms. Foster should focus on her assigned duties." But Hawthorne's predictable routine continued unchanged, and Victoria continued to watch him make himself vulnerable in ways that trained risk assessment professionals should have recognized immediately. The irony wasn't lost on her that a man paid handsomely to identify threats couldn't see the ones he was creating for himself. The dismissive atmosphere extended beyond individual interactions into the building's entire culture. During monthly staff meetings, Victoria was expected to attend but not participate. She sat in the back row with other support staff while executives discussed building operations, security protocols, and emergency procedures without ever soliciting input from the people who actually managed those systems daily. Last Tuesday's meeting had been particularly frustrating. The agenda included a discussion of new emergency evacuation procedures, led by Dennis Morrison from corporate security. Morrison outlined a plan that looked impressive on paper, but ignored several critical realities about how the building actually functioned during peak hours. Victoria knew that the main elevator bank couldn't handle a full building evacuation efficiently because 3 of the 8 elevators were routinely out of service during maintenance windows that Morrison's plan didn't account for. She knew that the stairwell on the east side had a door that stuck on the 32nd floor, requiring 2 people to open it properly. She knew that the parking garage had blind spots where people could get confused during an emergency. But when Morrison asked if there were any questions, Victoria remained silent. Past experience had taught her that security professionals didn't appreciate corrections from receptionists. regardless of how accurate those corrections might be. After the meeting, she overheard Morrison talking to Patterson in the hallway. "I think we've got a solid plan. The beauty of it is that it's simple enough that even the support staff can follow it without getting confused." The condescension was breathtaking. Morrison was discussing emergency procedures that could mean the difference between life and death during a crisis, and his primary concern was making them simple enough for people he assumed were less capable than himself. Victoria had supervised evacuations in combat zones where split-second decisions and detailed knowledge of local conditions were the only things standing between her unit and disaster. She understood that the most dangerous emergencies were often the ones that deviated from expected patterns, requiring adaptability and situational awareness that couldn't be reduced to simple procedures. But in Morrison's world, she was just someone who answered phones and couldn't be trusted to understand anything more complex than following basic instructions. The pattern extended to seemingly minor interactions that accumulated into a constant background of dismissal. Elevator conversations that stopped when she stepped aboard, as if her presence meant the discussion was no longer private. Lunch invitations that never came her way, despite 3 years of professional interactions with the same group of people. Conference calls where she was introduced as Victoria, who will be taking notes, rather than as someone who might contribute to the discussion. Even her attempts to build genuine professional relationships were subtly undermined by assumptions about her role and capabilities. When Sarah Martinez from Legal had complimented Victoria's organizational skills, she'd added, "You should think about taking some business courses at night. With your attention to detail, you might be able to move up to an administrative assistant position." The suggestion was meant kindly, but it revealed how completely Sarah had missed Victoria's actual qualifications. Victoria held a bachelor's degree with honors and had managed complex intelligence operations, involving millions of dollars in resources and dozens of personnel. But because she worked reception, people assumed she was starting from the bottom of a career ladder they'd mapped out for her. Perhaps most frustrating was the way her military service was either ignored or misunderstood when people learned about it. Some colleagues seemed to think her Army experience was like an extended internship, valuable for teaching basic discipline, but not particularly relevant to civilian work. Others made awkward jokes about her being tough enough to handle difficult callers, reducing 8 years of specialized training to a personality trait. Nobody asked about her actual military role, her security clearance level, or the specific skills she'd developed. The assumption seemed to be that any job sophisticated enough to transfer to corporate work would have led to a position more important than reception. As Victoria managed the afternoon's steady flow of calls, visitors, and minor crises, she reflected on the peculiar blindness that seemed to affect otherwise intelligent people. They could analyze market trends, negotiate complex contracts, and manage multi-million-dollar portfolios, but they couldn't see past their own assumptions about who deserved respect and who could be safely dismissed. It was a dangerous blindness, she knew. In her experience, the people most likely to underestimate threats were the ones who'd never encountered consequences for their assumptions. And in a building full of people who'd built their careers on predicting risks while remaining safely insulated from physical danger, that blindness could prove costly if real threats ever materialized. But for now, Victoria continued her quiet vigil, watching and learning while remaining invisible to people who might someday need her more than they could possibly imagine. Every evening at 6:47 p.m., exactly 12 hours after her arrival, Victoria Foster locked her reception desk and began what appeared to be a simple end-of-day routine. She gathered her purse, straightened her workspace, and exchanged polite goodbyes with the security guards who monitored the lobby overnight. To anyone watching, she was just another office worker heading home after a long day. But Victoria's real work was just beginning. Instead of heading directly to the parking garage, She took a detour through the building's lower levels, areas that most employees never saw and executives didn't know existed. The basement housed mechanical systems, storage areas, and service corridors that connected to every floor through maintenance shafts and utility tunnels. Victoria had spent months mapping these spaces during her lunch breaks, claiming she was taking walks for exercise while actually conducting reconnaissance that would have impressed her former intelligence colleagues. Tonight, like every night for the past 6 weeks, she made her way to Sub-Level 2, where the building's central security office operated behind unmarked doors. The night shift security supervisor, Frank Rodriguez, had served 2 tours in Iraq before taking the job at Meridian. Unlike the day shift personnel who treated security as a routine administrative function, Frank understood that vigilance required constant attention to detail. "Evening, Victoria," Frank said, looking up from a bank of monitors that showed feeds from cameras throughout the building. "How are things upstairs today?" "Interesting," Victoria replied, settling into the chair beside his workstation. "Those maintenance contractors from this morning, did their work orders check out?" Frank's expression grew serious. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I ran their credentials through our verification system twice. The company exists. The uniforms match, even the ID numbers are legitimate. But something feels off." He pulled up a series of time-stamped photos on his screen. "Look at this. They spent 43 minutes examining elevator controls on the 47th floor. Real maintenance workers don't need that long to assess standard systems they should already know." Victoria leaned forward, studying the images with trained eyes. "What about their tools? Equipment manifests?" "That's another red flag. Their toolkit was too generic, basic hand tools and electronic devices that could serve multiple purposes. No specialized elevator maintenance equipment. And watch this." Frank advanced to video footage of the 3 men in a service corridor. "See how they're moving? They're not focused on mechanical systems. They're measuring distances, checking sight lines, noting camera positions." Victoria felt the familiar tingle of recognition that came from pattern analysis. "They're conducting operational planning. The question is for what?" Over the past 3 years, Victoria and Frank had developed an unofficial partnership that bridged the gap between her daytime observations and his nighttime security duties. While the building's official security protocols operated through rigid hierarchies and formal reporting structures, they'd created their own information-sharing network based on mutual respect and shared military experience. Frank had recognized Victoria's background within a week of her arrival. Not through her personnel file, but through the way she moved, the way she observed her environment, and the quality of her situational awareness. He'd been the first person at Meridian to ask about her military service with genuine interest rather than polite curiosity. "Show me what else you've collected," Victoria said. Settling in for their nightly intelligence review, Frank opened a secure folder on his computer that contained their joint documentation of suspicious activities over the past 2 months. Every unusual visitor, every deviation from normal patterns, every security incident that the day shift had dismissed as routine. They'd cataloged it all with the thoroughness of professionals who understood that threats rarely announced themselves clearly. "The pattern's accelerating," Frank said, pointing to a timeline they'd constructed. 3 weeks ago, we had maybe 1 or 2 anomalies per week. Now we're seeing something unusual almost daily." Victoria reviewed the entries, each one representing hours of careful observation and documentation. The lost delivery driver who'd spent 15 minutes asking detailed questions about weekend staffing. The cleaning crew supervisor who'd been replaced without proper notification. The telecommunications technician who'd requested access to areas that didn't match his stated work order. Individually, each incident could be explained as routine business or minor administrative confusion. Collectively, they painted the picture of a systematic intelligence gathering operation. "Look at this," Victoria said, pointing to a series of entries from the past week. They're not just gathering information randomly. They're specifically focused on executive floor access, emergency response procedures, and security shift changes. Someone is planning something that requires detailed knowledge of how this building operates during different scenarios. Frank nodded grimly. I've been thinking the same thing. But try explaining that to Morrison's team upstairs. They're so focused on their electronic systems and formal protocols that they can't see threats that don't fit their predetermined categories. This was the crucial difference between corporate security and military intelligence. Corporate security was designed to prevent common crimes, theft, unauthorized access, workplace violence. Military intelligence was designed to identify and counter sophisticated threats that adapted to defensive measures and exploited assumptions about normal behavior. Victoria opened her own notebook, the one she disguised as an appointment book during day shifts. Inside were detailed floor plans she'd drawn from memory, annotated with information that no official building schematic contained. Exit routes that were often blocked by maintenance equipment. Elevators that frequently malfunctioned during peak hours, conference rooms with sightlines that could be exploited by someone conducting surveillance. I've been thinking about vulnerability assessments, she said, spreading her diagrams across Frank's desk. If someone wanted to target this building, what would they need to succeed? Together, they began analyzing Meridian Financial Tower not as a workplace, but as a potential target. Victoria's intelligence training had taught her to think like an adversary, to identify weaknesses that defenders might overlook, and to anticipate how threats might evolve beyond initial planning. Access is the first challenge, Frank said. The lobby security is actually pretty good during business hours. Multiple checkpoints, visitor registration, ID verification. But there are 17 different ways to enter this building. Without going through the main lobby, Victoria finished. Service entrances, parking garage access, loading docks, maintenance tunnels. And most of those rely on ID badges that can be cloned or uniforms that can be replicated. They worked through various scenarios, testing their assumptions against the building's actual defenses rather than its theoretical security measures. What they discovered was troubling, but not surprising. Meridian's security was designed to look impressive and handle routine problems, but it had multiple critical vulnerabilities that could be exploited by determined adversaries with proper planning. The executive floors are actually the most vulnerable, Victoria realized, tracing routes on her hand-drawn maps. All the security focus is on controlling access from below, but once someone reaches the upper levels, there are fewer monitoring systems and more isolated areas. Frank pulled up camera feeds from the 47th floor. Look at the coverage gaps. Someone with knowledge of our surveillance layout could move through significant portions of the executive area without being recorded. As they worked through their analysis, Victoria felt the familiar rhythm of intelligence preparation that had sustained her through multiple deployments. The careful gathering of information, the methodical assessment of threats and vulnerabilities, the development of response plans for scenarios that others preferred not to consider. But there was a crucial difference between her military experience and her current situation. In the Army, her intelligence assessments had been valued, analyzed, and incorporated into operational planning. At Meridian, her insights were dismissed as the overactive imagination of support staff who didn't understand how business really worked. We need to document everything, Victoria said, making notes in her precise handwriting. If something does happen, we want a complete record of the warning signs that were ignored. Frank agreed, but his expression was grim. The question is whether anyone will listen if we try to escalate our concerns. Victoria had been thinking about the same problem. Military intelligence operated through clear chain of command structures, where threat assessments were taken seriously regardless of their source. Corporate environments seemed to filter information through hierarchy and politics, often dismissing Valuable intelligence because it came from unexpected sources. We focus on preparation, she decided. We can't control whether other people take threats seriously, but we can control our own readiness to respond if those threats materialize. Over. The next hour, they developed response protocols for various emergency scenarios. Not the official evacuation procedures that Dennis Morrison had outlined in his meeting, but practical plans based on their detailed knowledge of how the building actually functioned under stress. Victoria's military training had taught her that the best security came not from preventing all possible attacks, but from being prepared to respond effectively when prevention failed. And her months of careful observation had given her insights into Meridian's vulnerabilities that no security manual could provide. As their session concluded, Frank compiled their findings into an encrypted file that he backed up to a secure external drive. If something happens, this intelligence could make the difference between chaos and controlled response. Victoria gathered her materials, returning her notebook to its disguise as office supplies. Tomorrow, she would resume her role as Meridian's invisible receptionist, answering phones and managing visitors while conducting surveillance that her colleagues couldn't imagine. But tonight, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a professional who had done the work that others wouldn't do, prepared for possibilities that others refused to consider, and maintained readiness that could prove crucial when preparation time ended and action began. The building settled into its nighttime rhythm around them. 47 floors of sleeping offices and empty corridors. Most of Meridian's employees were at home, confident that tomorrow would bring nothing more challenging than meetings, phone calls, and routine business decisions. Victoria knew better. In her experience, the most dangerous threats were the ones that developed slowly, gathering strength while defenders focused on familiar problems and comfortable assumptions. And she was ready. Tuesday morning arrived with the deceptive calm that Victoria had learned to distrust during her military service. At 6:47 a.m., she performed her usual arrival routine, but something felt different in the building's atmosphere. The overnight security reports showed nothing unusual, yet her instincts, honed through years of detecting threats before they fully materialized, were sending quiet warning signals. The first sign came at 8:23 a.m. when the main elevator bank experienced what the building's automated systems logged as a minor technical malfunction. 3 of the 8 elevators went offline simultaneously, their control panels displaying maintenance codes that required manual reset procedures. Dennis Morrison's security team dismissed it as a routine system glitch, the kind of minor inconvenience that occurred periodically in any large building, but Victoria noticed details that others missed. The elevator malfunction had occurred during the morning rush when maximum passenger flow would create the most disruption. The affected elevators were specifically the ones that served the executive floors most efficiently, and the timing coincided perfectly with a shift change in the building's security personnel. She made a note in her disguised journal: elevator systems compromised at optimal disruption time, coordinated with security rotation, not random. At 9:15 a.m., the second anomaly appeared. A telecommunications upgrade team arrived in the lobby, presenting proper credentials and work orders for maintenance on the building's internal communication systems. Their paperwork was flawless, their uniforms authentic, and their equipment appeared standard for the stated job. Victoria processed their visitor registration with professional efficiency while conducting her own rapid assessment. The team leader, who introduced himself as David Walsh from Syntec Communications, had the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to accessing secure facilities. His 2 colleagues remained quiet, letting Walsh handle all interactions while they focused on their equipment cases. But Walsh made 2 critical mistakes that revealed the true nature of their visit. First, when Victoria asked for his driver's license to verify his identity against the visitor log, he hesitated for exactly 1.3 seconds before producing it, the precise delay pattern She'd learned to recognize when people were accessing false documents rather than retrieving familiar personal items. Second, when she mentioned that the building's telecommunications supervisor would need to escort them to restricted areas, Walsh's micro-expression showed relief rather than the mild impatience that legitimate contractors typically displayed when dealing with security protocols. "Of course," Walsh said smoothly. "We're familiar with proper procedures. This type of upgrade requires access to several floors, so we appreciate the building's security measures." Victoria completed their registration while mentally cataloging additional observations. The equipment cases were slightly too heavy for standard telecommunications gear, suggesting contents beyond routine maintenance tools. Walsh's colleagues had positioned themselves to maintain visual contact with all lobby entrances, a surveillance pattern rather than the focused attention typical of technicians preparing for specific work. As the team disappeared into the elevator with Tommy Chun from building maintenance, Victoria immediately activated the discrete communication system she'd established with Frank Rodriguez. A simple text message that appeared to be about lunch plans, but actually meant code yellow suspicious activity requiring immediate investigation. Frank's response came back within 2 minutes, checking now. Meanwhile, the building's normal Tuesday rhythm continued around increasingly abnormal undercurrents. Margaret Whitfield's assistant called to confirm the rescheduled Davidson Group meeting, now expanded to include international partners via video conference. Dr. Hawthorne's predictable routine brought him through the lobby at exactly 9:47 a.m. Following his usual path to the parking garage, without noticing the subtle changes in building security status. At 10:05 a.m., Victoria received a call that made her blood freeze. "Meridian Financial, this is Victoria. How may I help you?" "Victoria, this is Linda Chun from Davidson Group." The voice was strained, barely controlled panic bleeding through professional composure. "I need to speak with someone in authority immediately. Our CEO received a very disturbing phone call this morning." Victoria's training kicked in automatically. When civilians used phrases like "very disturbing" and "immediately," they were usually describing threats that they didn't know how to categorize. "I'm connecting you to Mr. Patterson's office right away. Can you give me any additional details that might help him prepare for your call?" Someone claiming to represent Meridian Financial contacted Mr. Davidson directly at his private number, a number that's not publicly available. They knew details about today's expanded meeting that we only finalized yesterday evening. They suggested that Mr. Davidson might want to reconsider his travel plans to New York. The implications hit Victoria like physical blows. Davidson Group's CEO had been contacted by someone with access to confidential meeting information and private contact details. The caller had knowledge of yesterday's schedule changes and today's video conference expansion. Most critically, they'd suggested avoiding travel to New York on the specific day when the most comprehensive business meeting in Davidson Group's history was scheduled to occur. "Linda, I'm transferring you immediately. This information needs to reach our security team right away." But as Victoria attempted to connect the call to Patterson's office, she discovered that the building's internal phone system was experiencing temporary routing delays. The exact type of communication disruption that could isolate different floors from each other during a crisis. She tried Morrison's security office directly. The line rang 4 times before reaching voicemail. She attempted to reach Frank Rodriguez through their emergency communication protocol. No response. Victoria felt the familiar sensation of puzzle pieces clicking into place, forming a picture that was both clear and terrifying. The elevator disruptions, the telecommunications team, the targeting of Davidson Group's CEO, and the communication system failures weren't separate incidents. They were coordinated elements of a sophisticated operation designed to isolate Meridian Financial Tower and neutralize its most valuable business relationships. At 10:17 a.m., The building's public address system crackled to life with an announcement that confirmed Victoria's worst fears. Attention all building personnel. Due to unexpected maintenance requirements, the building is temporarily implementing restricted access protocols. All employees should remain at their current workstations, while technical teams complete emergency system updates. Normal operations will resume shortly. The announcement sounded official, even reassuring. But Victoria recognized it as a classic control tactic, using authority and false normalcy to prevent people from reacting to danger. Until resistance became impossible, she looked around the lobby and saw the announcement's intended effect. Visitors checked their phones and settled into waiting area chairs, assuming they were experiencing a minor inconvenience. Building employees shrugged and returned to their desks, trusting that someone else was handling whatever technical problem required attention. But Victoria's military training had taught her to recognize the moment when a situation transitioned from potential threat to active operation. The pattern of disruptions, the timing of communications failures, and the sophisticated coordination of seemingly unrelated events all pointed to the same conclusion. Meridian Financial Tower was under attack by adversaries who had spent months planning every detail of their operation. At 10:24 a.m., Victoria's cell phone received a text message from an unknown number. Maintain normal operations. Do not attempt to contact external authorities. Cooperation ensures everyone's safety. The message had been sent to her personal device, which meant someone had accessed employee records to obtain contact information. They knew who she was, where she worked, and how to reach her directly. Most importantly, they were monitoring the building closely enough to observe individual behavior and respond to potential resistance. Victoria deleted the message and made a decision that would have been impossible to explain to her colleagues. She was going to treat this as a military operation rather than a civilian emergency. In her experience, sophisticated threats required sophisticated responses. The adversaries clearly had detailed intelligence about Meridian's operations, employee routines, and security measures. They'd compromised building systems, isolated communications, and demonstrated knowledge of confidential business relationships, but they'd made one critical miscalculation. They'd dismissed the building's receptionist as a controllable variable rather than recognizing her as a trained intelligence operative with 8 years of experience in exactly these types of scenarios. Victoria opened her disguised notebook and began implementing the emergency protocols she and Frank had developed during their evening sessions. Not the official evacuation procedures that assumed cooperation from building systems and external authorities, but the practical response plans designed for situations where normal support structures had been compromised. Phase 1. Assess the true scope of the threat and identify adversary capabilities. Phase 2. Establish communication with any remaining friendly assets. Phase 3. Begin counter-operations designed to disrupt adversary plans and protect civilians. As Victoria initiated her response, she felt the familiar calm that came from transitioning from observer to operator. For months, she'd been gathering intelligence and preparing for scenarios that others refused to consider. Now those preparations would determine whether Meridian Financial Tower became a successful target or a failed operation that underestimated the wrong person. The building's normal Tuesday morning continued around her, but Victoria Foster was no longer just a receptionist. She was a military intelligence operative conducting defensive operations in hostile territory, and the battle for Meridian Financial Tower had officially begun. At 10:31 a.m., Victoria made a choice that would define everything that followed. She could continue playing the role of compliant receptionist, following instructions from unknown adversaries who clearly had detailed plans for controlling the building and its occupants. Or she could activate 8 years of military training and treat this situation as what it actually was, a hostile takeover requiring immediate, Defensive action. The decision crystallized when she observed 3 men in maintenance uniforms emerging from the service elevator near the loading dock. These weren't the same men from yesterday's reconnaissance, but their movement patterns were identical, too purposeful for routine maintenance workers, too coordinated for coincidental arrival. Timing. They carried equipment cases that moved with the weight distribution of tactical gear, rather than building maintenance tools. Victoria recognized the critical moment that every intelligence operative learns to identify, the transition point where gathering information becomes less important than acting on it. She'd spent months documenting threats and building evidence, but evidence was worthless if no one survived to present it. She activated her cell phone's video recording function and discreetly placed it to capture the lobby area, then opened her laptop to access the building's internal systems. Her reception desk computer had administrative privileges that she'd never used. Access levels granted because someone had assumed that receptionists would never need anything beyond basic visitor management functions. That assumption was about to prove catastrophically wrong. Victoria's first priority was establishing communication with Frank Rodriguez, who represented her only confirmed ally with security access and military experience. The building's internal phone system remained compromised, but she had a backup plan developed during their evening intelligence sessions. She accessed the building's emergency notification system, officially designed for fire alerts and evacuation announcements, but actually capable of sending discreet messages to any personnel with proper security clearance. Victoria composed a message that would appear routine to anyone monitoring communications, but would immediately alert Frank to the true situation. Facilities management. Urgent evac inspection required sub-level 2. Multiple system anomalies detected. Immediate technical assessment needed. The message used terminology that Frank would recognize as their predetermined code for active hostile operation in progress. Implement emergency protocols immediately. Within 90 seconds, her computer screen showed Frank's response through the same emergency notification system. Technical team dispatched. Full diagnostic procedures initiated. Translation. Message received. Emergency response activated. But Victoria's relief was short-lived. At 10:38 a.m., the fake telecommunications team returned to the lobby, and their demeanor had changed completely. David Walsh no longer projected the confident professionalism of a legitimate contractor. His movements were sharp, focused, and unmistakably tactical. His 2 colleagues flanked the reception desk with the practiced spacing of operators who'd rehearsed this specific approach. Miss Foster, Walsh said, his voice carrying a new edge of authority. We need you to make an announcement over the building's public address system. You'll tell all personnel that the telecommunications upgrade requires temporary suspension of external communications, no cell phones, no internet access, no contact with outside offices. Victoria met his gaze with the calm expression she'd perfected during years of dealing with hostile interrogations. I'll need authorization from building management before making any announcements that affect normal operations. Walsh's smile was cold and knowing. Miss Foster, I think we both understand that normal operations ended about 20 minutes ago. You're going to make that announcement because cooperation keeps everyone safe and resistance creates problems that no one wants to deal with. The threat was clear, professional, and delivered with the confidence of someone who'd planned for exactly this scenario. But Walsh had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd approached Victoria as if she were a civilian employee who could be controlled through intimidation and implied violence. Instead, he was facing a combat veteran who'd been threatened by significantly more dangerous people than corporate mercenaries pretending to be telecommunications contractors. I understand your position, Victoria replied evenly. But I'm sure you understand that I need to follow proper protocols for any building-wide announcements. As she spoke, Victoria's hands moved with practiced casualness across her desk. activating systems that Walsh couldn't see from his position. She triggered the building's discrete security alert, not the general alarm that would create panic, but the silent notification that alerted all security personnel to potential threats requiring immediate attention. More importantly, she activated the lockdown protocol for the building's executive floors. Not the fake maintenance lockdown that the adversaries had announced, but the real security measure designed to seal the upper levels and protect high-value personnel during emergencies. Walsh's expression shifted as he realized Victoria wasn't responding with the fear and compliance that his threats were designed to produce. "Ms. Foster, I don't think you're taking this situation seriously enough." "I'm taking it very seriously," Victoria said. "That's why I'm not going to help you. Do whatever you're planning to do to the people in this building." The moments stretched between them, laden with the recognition that negotiations had failed and the situation was about to escalate beyond talking. Walsh's hand moved toward his equipment case with the deliberate motion of someone accessing weapons that they'd hoped not to need. But Victoria had been preparing for this exact scenario since her first week at Meridian Financial. While Walsh was still reaching for his concealed firearm, she was already implementing the defensive protocols that she and Frank had developed during months of planning for sophisticated threats. Her left hand activated the emergency communication system one final time, sending a coded message that Frank would understand immediately. Fire drill procedures initiated. All safety personnel respond to stations. Translation: active hostile contact confirmed. Initiate combat response protocols. Her right hand moved to the concealed weapon that she'd carried every day for 3 years, hidden in a modified compartment of her reception desk that building security had never detected. Not because they couldn't have found it, but because they'd never considered that their receptionist might need personal protection or have the training to use it effectively. Walsh's weapon cleared his equipment case a fraction of a second before Victoria's cleared her desk drawer. But fractions of seconds were everything in close-quarters combat, and Victoria had spent years training for situations where survival depended on those microscopic advantages. "I need you to reconsider your approach," Victoria said, her voice remaining completely calm despite the fact that she was now holding a service pistol in a low-ready position. "This building has security measures that you haven't accounted for, and resistance that you weren't prepared to encounter." Walsh stared at her with the shock of someone whose fundamental assumptions about a situation had just been destroyed. He'd planned for cooperative civilians, intimidated employees, and passive compliance from people who'd never faced real violence. Instead, he was looking at a military intelligence operative who'd been conducting counter-surveillance for months and was prepared to defend her position with lethal force if necessary. "You're just a receptionist," Walsh said, but his voice carried uncertainty for the first time since entering the building. "No," Victoria replied, maintaining her ready position while calculating distances, angles, and tactical options. "I'm the person who's been watching you plan this operation for weeks. I'm the person who knows exactly how many of you there are, what systems you've compromised, and what you're trying to accomplish. And I'm the person who's going to stop you." Walsh's two colleagues moved to flank Victoria's position, but she'd already anticipated their approach patterns. The reception desk was positioned to provide defensive cover while maintaining sightlines to all lobby entrances. More importantly, her months of studying the building's architecture had identified exactly how to use the lobby's layout to her tactical advantage. "You can't protect everyone," Walsh said, trying to regain psychological control of the situation. "This building has 47 floors and hundreds of people. You're one person with limited ammunition facing a coordinated operation that's been planning this for months." Victoria smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "You're right about one thing," she said. "This has been planned for months, but you weren't the only ones doing the planning." At 10:43 a.m., the building's real security measures activated. Not the systems that Walsh's team had identified and compromised, but the backup protocols that Victoria and Frank had developed independently. Emergency lockdown sealed critical access points. Hidden cameras began recording from angles that the adversaries hadn't detected. And most importantly, discreet alarms reached the few personnel who'd been briefed on the possibility of sophisticated threats, requiring military-style responses. Victoria had spent 3 years being dismissed as just the receptionist by people who couldn't imagine that someone in her position might have capabilities beyond answering phones and managing visitors. But those same assumptions that had made her invisible to colleagues had also made her invisible to adversaries who'd planned their operation around controlling obvious threats while ignoring hidden ones. The moment of decision was over. Victoria Foster was no longer pretending to be a helpless civilian, and Meridian Financial Tower's real defenses were about to reveal themselves to adversaries who'd planned for the wrong enemy entirely. The battle for control of the building was about to begin, and both sides were about to discover what happened when months of preparation met the reality of combat between professionals who'd underestimated each other in very different ways. At 10:44 a.m., Walsh made the tactical error that Victoria had been anticipating since the moment he'd revealed his weapon. Instead of maintaining his defensive position and calling for backup, he allowed his shock at discovering an armed receptionist to override his operational training. He took a step forward, bringing himself within the critical distance where Victoria's close-quarters combat expertise would prove decisive. Victoria moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent years translating muscle memory into survival. As Walsh advanced, she pivoted left behind her reception desk while simultaneously drawing a concealed tactical baton from her modified desk drawer. The movement was economical, practiced, and completely unexpected by adversaries who'd planned their operation around controlling civilian employees. Walsh's first shot went wide, striking the marble wall behind Victoria's previous position as she rolled behind the reception desk's reinforced structure. But Victoria had studied this lobby for 3 years, and she knew something that Walsh's reconnaissance team had missed. The reception desk was positioned to provide not just administrative convenience, but tactical cover that could protect against small arms fire while maintaining sight lines to all primary access points. From her covered position, Victoria could see Walsh's 2 colleagues moving to flank her location using the lobby's decorative columns for concealment. Their movement patterns revealed military training, but also showed they'd planned for a quick intimidation operation rather than sustained combat in a defended position. Victoria activated her concealed throat microphone, military-grade communication, equipment that she'd disguised as a medical alert device for 3 years. Frank, hostiles engaged in main lobby. 3 armed military training, attempting to control building access. Initiating defensive protocols. Frank's response came through her nearly invisible earpiece. Copy. Security lockdown complete on executive floors. Counter-assault team moving to your position. Hold for 2 minutes. 2 minutes was an eternity in close-quarters combat, but Victoria had trained for exactly these scenarios during 8 years of military service in environments significantly more dangerous than corporate lobbies. The question wasn't whether she could survive 2 minutes against 3 armed opponents. It was whether she could neutralize the threats before they adapted to her unexpected resistance. Walsh made his second crucial mistake by assuming that Victoria would remain in a defensive position behind her desk. Instead, she used the lobby's architecture to her advantage, moving laterally along the marble wall toward the elevator bank while maintaining cover behind decorative pillars that provided concealment but not protection. Her movement drew fire from Walsh's colleagues, but their shots were hurried and imprecise, the response pattern of people who'd expected intimidation to work and weren't prepared for sustained engagement with a trained opponent. Victoria reached the elevator bank and immediately implemented a tactic that her adversaries couldn't have anticipated. She used her administrative access to trap them in the lobby. With quick keystrokes on the elevator control panel, she locked down all passenger elevators and activated the building's emergency access restrictions. Walsh and his team were now isolated in the lobby with no rapid escape routes and no way to access the upper floors where their primary objectives waited. More importantly, they were facing an opponent who understood the building's systems better than they did and had planned for exactly this type of scenario. Asterisk, you're making this harder than it needs to be, Walsh called out, his voice echoing across the marble lobby. We just need access to the executive floors. Nobody needs to get hurt if you cooperate. As she spoke, Victoria's hands moved with practiced casualness across her desk, activating systems that Walsh couldn't see from his position. She triggered the building's discrete security alert, not the general alarm that would create panic, but the silent notification that alerted all security personnel to potential threats requiring immediate attention. More importantly, she activated the lockdown protocol for the building's executive floors. Not the fake maintenance lockdown that the adversaries had announced, but the real security measure designed to seal the upper levels and protect high-value personnel during emergencies. Walsh's expression shifted as he realized Victoria wasn't responding with the fear and compliance that his threats were designed to produce. Ms. Foster, I don't think you're taking this situation seriously enough. I'm taking it very seriously, Victoria said. That's why I'm not going to help you. Do whatever you're planning to do to the people in this building. The moments stretched between them, laden with the recognition that negotiations had failed and the situation was about to escalate beyond talking. Walsh's hand moved toward his equipment case with the deliberate motion of someone accessing weapons that they'd hoped not to need, but Victoria had been preparing for this exact scenario since her first week at Meridian Financial. While Walsh was still reaching for his concealed firearm, she was already implementing the defensive protocols that she and Frank had developed during months of planning for sophisticated threats. Her left hand activated the emergency communication system one final time, sending a coded message that Frank would understand immediately. Fire drill procedures initiated. All safety personnel respond to stations. Translation: active hostile contact confirmed. Initiate combat response protocols. Her right hand moved to the concealed weapon that she'd carried every day for 3 years, hidden in a modified compartment of her reception desk that building security had never detected. Not because they couldn't have found it, but because they'd never considered that their receptionist might need personal protection or have the training to use it effectively. Walsh's weapon cleared his equipment case a fraction of a second before Victoria's cleared her desk drawer. But fractions of seconds were everything in close-quarters combat, and Victoria had spent years training for situations where survival depended on those microscopic advantages. I need you to reconsider your approach, Victoria said, her voice remaining completely calm despite the fact that she was now holding a service pistol in a low-ready position. This building has security measures that you haven't accounted for, and resistance that you weren't prepared to encounter. Walsh stared at her with the shock of someone whose fundamental assumptions about a situation had just been destroyed. He'd planned for cooperative civilians, intimidated employees, and passive compliance from people who'd never faced real violence. Instead, he was looking at a military intelligence operative who'd been conducting counter-surveillance for months and was prepared to defend her position with lethal force if necessary. You're just a receptionist, Walsh said, but his voice carried uncertainty for the first time since entering the building. No, Victoria replied, maintaining her ready position while calculating distances, angles, and tactical options. I'm the person who's been watching you plan this operation for weeks. I'm the person who knows exactly how many of you there are, what systems you've compromised, and what you're trying to accomplish. And I'm the person who's going to stop you. Walsh's two colleagues moved to flank Victoria's position, but she'd already anticipated their approach patterns. The reception desk was positioned to provide defensive cover while maintaining sightlines to all lobby entrances. More importantly, her months of studying the building's architecture had identified exactly how to use the lobby's layout to her tactical advantage. "You can't protect everyone," Walsh said, trying to regain psychological control of the situation. "This building has 47 floors and hundreds of people. You're one person with limited ammunition facing a coordinated operation that's been planning this for months." Victoria smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "You're right about one thing," she said. "This has been planned for months. But you weren't the only ones doing the planning." At 10:43 a.m., the building's real security measures activated. Not the systems that Walsh's team had identified and compromised, but the backup protocols that Victoria and Frank had developed independently. Emergency lockdown sealed critical access points. Hidden cameras began recording from angles that the adversaries hadn't detected. And most importantly, discreet alarms reached the few personnel who'd been briefed on the possibility of sophisticated threats, requiring military-style responses. Victoria had spent 3 years being dismissed as just the receptionist by people who couldn't imagine that someone in her position might have capabilities beyond answering phones and managing visitors. But those same assumptions that had made her invisible to colleagues had also made her invisible to adversaries who'd planned their operation around controlling obvious threats while ignoring hidden ones that the moment of decision was over. Victoria Foster was no longer pretending to be a helpless civilian, and Meridian Financial Tower's real defenses were about to reveal themselves to adversaries who'd planned for the wrong enemy entirely. The battle for control of the building was about to begin, and both sides were about to discover what happened when months of preparation met the reality of combat between professionals who'd underestimated each other in very different ways. At 10:44 a.m., Walsh made the tactical error that Victoria had been anticipating since the moment he'd revealed his weapon. Instead of maintaining his defensive position and calling for backup, he allowed his shock at discovering an armed receptionist to override his operational training. He took a step forward, bringing himself within the critical distance where Victoria's close-quarters combat expertise would prove decisive. Victoria moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent years translating muscle memory into survival. As Walsh advanced, she pivoted left behind her reception desk while simultaneously drawing a concealed tactical baton from her modified desk drawer. The movement was economical, practiced, and completely unexpected by adversaries who'd planned their operation around controlling civilian employees. Walsh's first shot went wide, striking the marble wall behind Victoria's previous position as she rolled behind the reception desk's reinforced structure. But Victoria had studied this lobby for 3 years, and she knew something that Walsh's reconnaissance team had missed. The reception desk was positioned to provide not just administrative convenience, but tactical cover that could protect against small arms fire while maintaining sightlines to all primary access points. From her covered position, Victoria could see Walsh's 2 colleagues moving to flank her location using the lobby's decorative columns for concealment. Their movement patterns revealed military training, but also showed they'd planned for a quick intimidation operation rather than sustained combat in a defended position. Victoria activated her concealed throat microphone, military-grade communication, equipment that she'd disguised as a medical alert device for 3 years. "Frank, hostiles engaged in main lobby. 3 armed military training, attempting to control building access. Initiating defensive protocols." Frank's response came through her nearly invisible earpiece. "Copy. Security lockdown complete on executive floors. Counter-assault team moving to your position. Hold for 2 minutes." 2 minutes was an eternity in close-quarters combat, but Victoria had trained for exactly these scenarios during 8 years of military service in environments significantly more dangerous than corporate lobbies. The question wasn't whether She could survive 2 minutes against 3 armed opponents. It was whether she could neutralize the threats before they adapted to her unexpected resistance. Walsh made his second crucial mistake by assuming that Victoria would remain in a defensive position behind her desk. Instead, she used the lobby's architecture to her advantage, moving laterally along the marble wall toward the elevator bank while maintaining cover behind decorative pillars that provided concealment but not protection. Her movement drew fire from Walsh's colleagues, but their shots were hurried and imprecise, the response pattern of people who'd expected intimidation to work and weren't prepared for sustained engagement with a trained opponent. Victoria reached the elevator bank and immediately implemented a tactic that her adversaries couldn't have anticipated. She used her administrative access to trap them in the lobby. With quick keystrokes on the elevator control panel, she locked down all passenger elevators and activated the building's emergency access restrictions. Walsh and his team were now isolated in the lobby with no rapid escape routes and no way to access the upper floors where their primary objectives waited. More importantly, they were facing an opponent who understood the building's systems better than they did and had planned for exactly this type of scenario. Asterisk, you're making this harder than it needs to be, Walsh called out, his voice echoing across the marble lobby. We just need access to the executive floors. Nobody needs to get hurt if you cooperate. At 11:15 a.m., the FBI's Corporate Crime Division arrived with a tactical support unit and evidence collection specialists. Special Agent Sarah Martinez took one look at the secured scene and immediately sought out the person responsible for the successful defense. Ms. Foster, Agent Martinez said, extending her hand with the respect of one professional acknowledging another. Agent Martinez, FBI, I need to understand exactly what happened here. What followed was a debriefing that revealed the full scope of both the attack and Victoria's response. The 7 captured operatives were part of a sophisticated corporate espionage network targeting multiple financial firms. Their objective was stealing proprietary merger documents during the Davidson Group video conference, when all security attention would be focused on protecting the high-profile meeting. Victoria's intelligence, our EPORTS, had documented their reconnaissance activities for weeks. Her disruption of their communications equipment had prevented them from coordinating with external support teams. Most importantly, her decision to engage immediately rather than seeking authorization had stopped the operation before it could access its primary targets. Ms. Foster, Agent Martinez said after reviewing the evidence, this is some of the best preliminary intelligence work I've seen on a corporate espionage case. Your documentation provided enough detail for us to identify the broader network behind this operation. But the most significant vindication came at 11:43 a.m. when Davidson Group's CEO, Robert Davidson, arrived at Meridian Financial Tower despite the morning's security threats. He'd insisted on completing the merger discussions in person after learning that Victoria's actions had prevented the theft of documents that could have destroyed the deal. I need to meet the person who saved my company, Davidson said simply. When Margaret brought him to the lobby where Victoria was completing her statement to federal investigators, Davidson's response was immediate and unambiguous. Ms. Foster, I don't know what your current salary is, but I'm prepared to triple it if you'll consider joining Davidson Group as our Director of Corporate Security. The offer carried an annual salary that exceeded Margaret's compensation package and came with authority over a security budget larger than most corporations' entire operating expenses. But more importantly, it represented recognition of Victoria's actual capabilities rather than assumptions about her limitations. Margaret's reaction revealed everything about the corporate culture that had dismissed Victoria for 3 years. Instead of pride in her employees' extraordinary competence, she displayed territorial concern about losing a valuable asset that she'd never properly valued. Victoria has responsibilities here, Margaret said quickly. We couldn't possibly let her leave without proper transition planning. Victoria's response was delivered with the same professional courtesy she'd shown throughout 3 years of condescension and dismissal. "Ms. Whitfield, with respect, my transition plan is simple. You need to hire someone who understands that. Receptionists are people with qualifications, not interchangeable furniture that answers phones." Dennis Morrison arrived at 12:10 p.m. to find his security department being systematically dismantled by federal investigators, who'd discovered that his comprehensive security protocols had missed obvious surveillance, ignored credible threat assessments, and failed to detect a months-long intelligence operation conducted by adversaries using basic social engineering. "This is impossible," Morrison protested to Agent Martinez. "Our systems are state-of-the-art. We follow all industry standards." "Your systems protected against yesterday's threats," Agent Martinez replied. Ms. Foster was preparing for tomorrow's threats. That's the difference between security theater and actual security. The federal investigation revealed that Victoria's hidden intelligence work had prevented what could have been one of the most successful corporate espionage operations in recent history. The stolen merger documents would have been worth hundreds of millions of dollars to competitors, and the Davidson Group deal represented strategic positioning that could have affected entire market sectors. But perhaps the most telling vindication came from James Patterson, who arrived in the lobby at 12:25 p.m., expecting to find a minor security incident that required administrative attention. Instead, he found federal agents, tactical teams, and a crime scene that demonstrated how completely his assumptions about building security had failed. "Victoria," he said, approaching her with the hesitant manner of someone who suddenly realized they'd been fundamentally wrong about another person. "I need to apologize. I had no idea about your background, your capabilities, your—" "Mr. Patterson," Victoria interrupted gently, "you never asked. For 3 years, you called me Vicky and assumed I couldn't understand anything more complex than answering phones. You never considered that I might have insights worth hearing or capabilities worth utilizing." The statement wasn't delivered with anger or accusation, but with the calm authority of someone who no longer needed to prove her worth to people who demonstrated their inability to recognize competence. By 1 p.m., the story was spreading through every floor of Meridian Financial Tower, not the sanitized version that corporate communications would eventually release, but the unfiltered truth that traveled through personal networks. The receptionist had saved the building. The executives had missed obvious threats, and assumptions about hierarchy and competence had been spectacularly proven wrong. Victoria Foster was no longer invisible. But more importantly, she was no longer willing to remain in a position where her capabilities were wasted and her contributions were dismissed. The vindication was complete, but it had come at the cost of revealing just how blind intelligent people could be when they confused authority with competence and hierarchy with competence. The building that had dismissed her as just the receptionist would never be the same. And neither would Victoria, who'd spent 3 years hiding her true capabilities, but would never again accept a role that required her to be less than she was. 6 months later, Victoria Foster stood in the executive boardroom of Davidson Group Industries, reviewing security protocols for their newest acquisition with the same methodical attention that had once been dismissed as overprotective reception work. The brass nameplate on the conference table read Victoria Foster, Director of Corporate Security, but the transformation went far deeper than titles or salary increases. The woman who had once hidden intelligence reports in an appointment book now commanded a security budget of $12 million and supervised protective operations for Fortune 500 executives across 3 continents. But more importantly, she worked for an organization that valued her insights rather than dismissing them, that sought her analysis rather than ignoring it, and that understood the difference between competence and assumptions about competence. "Victoria," Robert Davidson said as he entered the boardroom with Linda Chun, who had become Davidson Group's chief operating officer after the merger deal was successfully completed. The State Department briefing confirmed what your threat assessment predicted. The industrial espionage network that targeted Meridian was part of a broader operation against American financial institutions. Victoria nodded, making notes in a leather portfolio that no longer needed to be disguised as anything other than what it was: professional documentation by a recognized expert in corporate security. The pattern analysis suggested coordination beyond a single target. Have they identified the other intended victims? 7 major firms, including 3 that handle government contracts, Linda replied. The FBI estimates that your disruption of the Meridian operation prevented potentially hundreds of millions in stolen intellectual property. But Victoria's satisfaction came not from the scale of the threat she'd prevented, but from working in an environment where threat assessment was valued before crises materialized, rather than dismissed until disasters proved their necessity. Transformation of her professional life had been dramatic, but the personal vindication ran even deeper. She no longer needed to arrive early to conduct surveillance that others couldn't imagine, or stay late to document patterns that others wouldn't acknowledge. Instead, she managed teams of former military and intelligence professionals who understood that the most dangerous threats were often the ones that looked like routine business. Her staff meetings were attended by people who'd served in Army intelligence, CIA operations, and FBI counterintelligence. They analyzed emerging threats with the same methodical precision that Victoria had brought to her hidden evening sessions with Frank Rodriguez, but now their work was supported by sophisticated technology and unlimited access to information. Networks.Frank had joined her team as Senior Security Coordinator, bringing his practical knowledge of building protection and his understanding of how corporate environments could be exploited by determined adversaries. Together, they developed security protocols that were being adopted by major corporations who'd learned that traditional approaches were inadequate against sophisticated threats. The consulting request from Meridian came in this morning, Frank mentioned during their weekly briefing. They want us to conduct a complete security overhaul for their new headquarters building. Victoria considered the irony of being asked to fix security problems at the corporation that had dismissed her insights for 3 years. But her response reflected the professionalism that had sustained her through military service and corporate invisibility alike. Schedule a preliminary assessment meeting. They need better security, and we can provide it. Past history doesn't change current responsibility. The request from Meridian was part of a broader transformation that had rippled through the corporate security industry. Victoria's successful defense had demonstrated that traditional approaches were inadequate against emerging threats, and her subsequent work with Davidson Group had established new standards for proactive threat assessment. She'd been invited to speak at security conferences where audiences included executives who'd once dismissed receptionists as interchangeable support staff. Her presentations focused not on her personal vindication, but on the systematic failures that allowed competent people to be overlooked while incompetent people retained authority over critical decisions. The most dangerous assumption in corporate security, she would tell audiences of executives and security professionals, is that threats will announce themselves clearly, and that competence can be identified through titles rather than demonstrated through performance. The transformation had extended beyond Victoria's individual success to influence how corporations approached both security and personnel management. Davidson Group had implemented policies requiring that all employees' backgrounds be reviewed for relevant experience that might be underutilized. Regardless of their current job functions, the results had been remarkable. They discovered a shipping clerk with diplomatic experience in hostile regions, an accounting assistant with language skills in strategic markets, and a maintenance supervisor with electronics expertise that proved invaluable for detecting surveillance equipment. People bring their entire lives to work, Victoria had explained to Robert Davidson during the policy development process. We can either capitalize on that experience or waste it by making assumptions about what people can contribute based on what we've asked them to do. The principle had become central to Davidson Group's competitive advantage in industries where traditional corporations continued to overlook talent that didn't fit conventional expectations. Victoria's transformation had also included a personal reckoning with her own choices during the years at Meridian. She'd proven that hiding extraordinary capabilities in ordinary positions could serve strategic purposes, but she'd also learned that accepting undervaluation carried costs beyond personal satisfaction. During a recent interview with a business magazine that was profiling her transition from receptionist to executive, Victoria had been asked whether she regretted the years of being dismissed and underestimated. "I regret that it took a crisis to demonstrate competence that should have been recognized through normal professional interaction," she'd replied. "But I don't regret the experience of seeing how organizations function when they think they're not being observed by anyone who matters." That perspective had informed her approach to building security systems that accounted for human assumptions as well as technological vulnerabilities. Her protocols assumed that adversaries would exploit expectations about who deserved attention and who could be safely ignored. The broader impact of Victoria's story had reached beyond corporate security into discussions about organizational psychology and talent management. Business schools were incorporating case studies about the Meridian incident into curricula about recognizing and utilizing hidden competencies within existing workforce structures. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was personal. Victoria no longer needed to compartmentalize her professional identity or accept roles that required her to be less than her full capabilities. She worked with people who understood her background, valued her insights, and expected her to contribute at the highest levels of her training and experience. The woman who had once been just the receptionist now sat in meetings with corporate executives, government officials, and international security specialists who sought her analysis of emerging threats. Her insights shaped policies that protected billions of dollars in assets and thousands of jobs across multiple industries. Yet, Victoria maintained the same methodical approach that had characterized her work at Meridian. She still arrived early, still conducted thorough preparation, still documented observations with precision that reflected military training. The difference was that now these habits were recognized as professional excellence, rather than dismissed as excessive attention to detail. On quiet evenings in her new office, Victoria would sometimes reflect on the path that had led from invisible receptionist to recognized executive. The transformation hadn't required her to become someone different. It had required others to see who she'd always been beneath their assumptions about what receptionists could or should contribute. The nameplate on her desk now read Victoria Foster, Director of Corporate Security, Davidson Group Industries. But the real transformation was that she no longer needed nameplates or titles to define her worth. She'd learned that competence spoke for itself when people were willing to listen, and that the most valuable recognition came from colleagues who understood excellence rather than those who needed crisis to reveal it. Sometimes the people we overlook aren't waiting for permission to be extraordinary. They're already extraordinary, waiting for the moment when their readiness meets the world's recognition that ordinary assumptions about talent and capability are often completely wrong. Victoria Foster had always been ready. The world had finally caught up. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.